Hello and welcome. I'm Olga Hannanen, and this is Academia Experience. Our guest today is Max Holleran, a senior lecturer in social policy at the Department of Social and Political Sciences, University of Melbourne. He expertises in urban development, focusing on the way cities manage tourism, housing, and densification. Hello, Max. Welcome to Academia Experience podcast. It's great to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
I want to talk to you about digital nomads today and your research about digital nomads. But my first question would be about your research on international property investments. So, before turning your attention to digital nomads, you have been looking into international property purchases, which is a very interesting but very different type of lifestyle in comparison to digital nomadism. As in international property investments, people make a permanent connection to a destination in a form of property that might lead to some tax benefits, residence permits, and even citizenship. And if you look at digital nomadism, they usually do not make digital nomads usually do not make a permanent connection to the places that they visit. So they are rather detached from the destination. Do you see any similarities between these two types of lifestyles and mobilities? Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they are very similar.
I guess I don't see many similarities in the people who are participating because, in general, it's usually people who are moving permanently, who are expatriating, whether they go somewhere for work, as an investment, as a second home, or for retirement. Whereas nomads are sort of defined by their hypermobility. They're not settling anywhere, they're continually moving their location. But the kind of socioeconomic infrastructure that allows for this kind of tourism is oftentimes pretty similar. It's places that have a lot of real estate in the tourism economy. Oftentimes, you could say it's places that have two different housing markets. So it's places that have the kind of locals housing market as well as a more speculative international property market, beachfront destinations, and sometimes popular tourism cities. So, in terms of regulation and economics, I do think there are some similarities in the sense that that where nomads are going are also places where people are buying second homes and places where there's a high amount of international property ownership. And oftentimes that's been facilitated by local and national laws that make it easier.
I see. So the infrastructure and the connectivity of certain destinations that what draws both international property investors and digital nomads to certain locations. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of, I mean, if we think about the ways that people can do citizenship by investment, or the free ownership has been made much easier for international buyers, places like Panama City, or even harder to access places due to immigration at the international level. So places like Miami very
Mm,
much fit that description.
I see. So, talking about digital nomads, your first publication was about pre and post pandemic trends in digital nomadism and how the role of a home state has been renegotiated, rethought. Um, so, apart the fact that the pandemic has facilitated remote work and digital nomadism, not only internationally but also domestically, what are the key insights from your research?
Oh, I really found that there was a sense in which people were rethinking their ability to be out of the office. And that was happening on a personal level, but also on an institutional level. On one hand, you have people who were sitting at home. I was one of them. I was living in Melbourne, Australia, which had the longest lockdown in the world. And people were thinking, wow, I'm here all the time, and my relationship is to the inside of my home and to my computer. And
Yeah.
if I could just take that computer somewhere else, what could my relationship to the world be? And so some people started doing that after the pandemic, and some people even did during the pandemic, sort of chasing different looser regulations where they could go and have fewer lockdowns and less vaccine orders, and that became something to them that was really associated with freedom. And on one hand, it was people who were sort of having a rethink of the state, and they were perturbed by the fact that the state was having all these new rules they had to deal with. And some people just did it opportunistically because they wanted to go somewhere else and they didn't want to sit in their apartment. They wanted to go sit in a hotel. And there was a lot of kind of larger economic factors that made this possible. So most people weren't traveling. And if you were traveling and it was legal to stay in a hotel, you could go rent a hotel room for the most bottom discount you can imagine. And because the hotel is completely empty, it's like, and people have these stories of it was like The Shining or something. Like they're in a hotel completely by themselves, and it's like them and their family, and no one else is there because the hotel is basically not functioning. Um, and I yes, I think that changed a lot. Institutions, I think, took a approach to it, which was as long as you get the work done, we'll let you do what you want to. Most of them are reining that in now, but I think that this is a big question that I think you and I both grapple with, which is we're still in a kind of limbo when it comes to employers about their rules. What are the rules? And in the end of the pandemic, and I think until now in 2024, um, you see employers still struggling with this. And it comes down to me on one hand of like, well, are we going to get the full productivity? Are we going to get a sort of institutional corporate community
Yeah.
with people being remote work? On the other hand, will we save massive amounts of money on fixed costs of office space?
Yeah.
And potentially in the future, also, the big question I think is well, could we also pay people less money because they can be responsible for their own geo arbitrage? So they no longer have to live in London or San Francisco or Sydney. They can live somewhere else. So those, I think, were the big questions that were coming up both for institutions and also for individuals. And I think policymakers have not really considered this. I think that starting the pandemic, it was a, a huge change. People were taken off guard, but I think that the world of policymaking has just not dealt with it at all.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very interesting point, and they're great insights. We really faced the remote work revolution during the pandemic. That's, as you mentioned, also on personal and the institutional level, really revolutionized the things. Um, and among others, you were also talking about mobility guilt that happened to appear during the pandemic. So, could you explain what is mobility guilt and what is digital nomads guilt of mobility?
Yeah, I see a few kinds of mobility guilt. Of course, I thought that the first one during the pandemic was people who were leaving when other people had to stay. And that could be in various ways. On one hand, someone might say, "Look, I don't like all these regulations. I'm not going to stay in the UK. I'm going to the Canary Islands." And they would say, "Oh, I feel bad. My family, they can't leave. They're in their house, and I'm here." And I'm like, there's in the Canary Islands, there's very few rules, and so that's the kind of level of personal guilt. Um, and also some of that was related to the kind of care work that people were expected to do, where people weren't taking care of their parents. They were and you see that this is the kind of guilt that many people feel in in migration, where they're not taking care of their parents. They're not maintaining their relationships with their friends and family. And that does produce guilt, despite the fact that many people have to move for economic reasons, for work reasons. There is always a feeling of, okay, well, I I'm severing ties, or the ties that I have at home are fraying a little bit because I have had to move. There's also the kind of like economic guilt of, I'm going somewhere, I'm leaving behind my community and I'm having this nice life. I think people might feel like, wow, I've really lucked out. And
Mm.
on a higher level, I think that there's sometimes a guilt about the socioeconomic divide that people encounter. So people who are hypermobile and they're going to Thailand and they're going to the Philippines and then they're going to Bali. And the people they meet from those countries, not only have they never left those countries, but they haven't left
Yeah.
their region or their city. So that's the kind of like, the privilege of people with powerful passports, good jobs, money, where their mobility is kind of limitless and they're in this new world of hypermobility. And then you get the kind of people who are locked in place. And that's a sort of basic economic issue. And the last thing I would say is the kind of climate change guilt of like, wow,
Mm.
my carbon footprint is quite big. And of course, nomads, as we know, they have a sort of conflicted relationship with this kind of large use of carbon. Because on one hand, they'll say, look, I don't have a house, I don't have a car, I'm not like using up carbon in the same ways that a lot of people who have more possessions, accumulated things may, but I have a lot of miles going back and forth in the sky. And when you look at the actual amount of carbon they're using, it's more. And so that
Yeah.
does, I think, become an issue. Yeah.
That's an interesting point because what when I was reading your paper, I thought that this mobility guilt was also imposed from the outside. That people who've been locked in their homes during the COVID, they are actually accused those who managed to travel or wanted to travel during the pandemic. So um, that's this mobility guilt was imposed from the outside. Am I right? Or
Oh,
was it a part? Yeah,
completely. Yeah. It's like, it was completely, people don't feel stigmatization and guilt just internally. They feel it because they've violated social norms. And they know that they've violated social norms because people tell them. And so their family says, how can you leave? Or people say, look, you're wandering all over the place. You're bringing COVID into these communities. That was a big issue, which you're supposed to be a good citizen by staying in one place and not moving around and moving your germs around as well. And I think that there still is, even though we've gotten out of this epidemiological thinking and the fear of COVID is really not with us so much anymore. I think there still is a lot of stigmatization about it, not really for climate change reasons, but for questions of like, what are you running away from? Why are you leaving? Why are you moving so much? People feeling like that the lack of connections is something that's problematic. And of
yeah,
course, this has always been the issue with mobility. Mobility has always been questioned because people don't have a place that they're from. And that's on the
yeah,
kind of, we can think about the idea of the rootless cosmopolitan and the 1930s rhetoric about, who fits this bill, Armenians, Jewish people, all these people who are, they're subverting national boundaries. But also you can think of it just in ways of people who move from one city to another and they give up their family for economic opportunity. And I think there's always been that like, oh, well, this person's leaving the village, they're leaving this city, they think they're better than us. And so mobility is always opportunity. But for people who are left behind, it can be very painful. And so, and that experience of pain, I think, is for the person who moves and for the people they move away from.
yeah. That's a very complex issue. Definitely, the mobility guilt when we look at it from different perspectives. Speaking about mobility and people moving, I know that one of your recent research is on living conditions in the countries that digital nomads and the cities that digital nomads are coming from. So, could you share some insights about that?
Yeah. So obviously, as you know, and you've written so much about, this is a really growing field. And we think a lot about digital nomads from the experience of labor. What kind of work can they perform? Where can they do that work? We think about it from destinations. So where are they going? How are they mixing with local people in a form of kind of transnational anthropological encounter. Um, Also, there's the kind of property markets, like what's happening with transnational gentrification. But I was really interested in why are people leaving where they're from? And the the kind of wanderlust idea of like, well, people are doing this because they just want to see the world. I agree with that. That's definitely true. But I was thinking also, we're in a moment where most global north economies are having massive housing crises. And people keep telling me about this, when they're talking about their travels. And I have worked on housing affordability. I even wrote a book about it. And I wasn't really asking them. I was kind of before I started this kind of work, I was saying, well, where have you gone? Why are you there? What kind of work are you doing? And they would start going on and on about their rent or their mortgage and how nice it was to leave it behind. And some of it was anti-materialist. It was, "Oh, it's so nice not to have a mortgage and to, get rid of my car." But then a lot of it was, uh, people saying, "I can live not just a middle class, but even a luxurious life somewhere else." And it was people who are really squeezed by the cost of living crisis, and, particularly in Europe, where wages have really suffered, inflation has been really high. People said, "Look, I did everything right. I have a good job. I have a master's degree. I am like, middle class by all standards, but I have trouble paying my bills. I live in an apartment." And then they'd say, "But if I went somewhere cheaper, I could, like, live in a hotel or I could rent, like, a house with a pool." And so that to me became really interesting of what's the push factor that we're leaving out here? And so I think and particularly in interviewing people, it was just so easy to put those stories together and just ask people like, "Hey, there's a global cost of living crisis. How did that affect you?" And they said, tremendously." People saying, "This was a huge reason that I left." And some people were leaving because they were single, because they didn't have children, because it was easier. But some people were saying, "No, no, I actually like had it wasn't that I was always considering leaving. It was because of this cost of living crisis." And it was hard for them to leave, but they felt like it was a good choice because of the expense of living in a big global north city.
Max, you recently came back from your fieldwork in Portugal. Could you tell us a little bit more? What were your aims and what did you look into in relation to digital nomads?
It's about places that are undergoing just massive transnational gentrification. And to me, I lived in Spain for quite a while. I've written about Spain. I've written about tourism in Spain, but I haven't been to Portugal for 20 years. And I was fascinated with how it was really becoming a mainstay of the economy, for better and worse. So Lisbon, of course, is dramatically affected by digital nomads and remote work. And there's a lot of infrastructure that's followed them there. So co-working spaces, uh, short let apartments, and kind of meshed into other parts of the tourism economy. But also, this is a moment where Southern European Mediterranean cities are really, really rethinking um, their relationship to tourism. They're really uh, angry about transnational gentrification. I will say that, in terms of housing prices, it's overstated actually, the level to which tourism has affected economies. But still, the financialization of the housing sector, the platforms, the way in which Airbnb has come into new neighborhoods, that's all extremely important. It's not reason why housing prices are going up. That's there's other more complex socioeconomic reasons for that happening, but it's a really visible part of that whole process. And it also really shows some of the failures of policymakers to make affordable housing, to keep housing affordable. Um, and it's very, very visible in Lisbon. So I'm quite interested in what will happen in some of these Mediterranean cities. on one hand, of course, you're going to see higher tax rates for Airbnb, and caps perhaps on rental properties, which I think is excellent idea. I think that it's too little, too late, and I think it won't have that much effect, unfortunately. Um, I also think that there might be like a larger rethink of tourism economies where you get places like Dubrovnik and Venice and Lisbon where they just have a massive amount of tourists. And, for a long time, it's been blamed on cruise ships and the kind of mass tourists who come in for one day. But I think we can say now that over tourism is at a higher level and that there has to be some way to control it in order for locals to live a life where they don't feel like they're inside of the exhibition of a museum. They don't feel like, they're part of a kind of uh
Showroom.
Showroom.
exactly, yeah, they're not, yeah, they're part. And so I'm not sure how policymakers will do that, but I think that anger has gotten really high. And I think we would have seen this earlier if it wasn't for the 2008 economic crisis and then the pandemic. I think that, the level that things were going up, um, would have caused this sense of alarm and these social movements that are contesting tourism earlier. But now, belatedly, it's happening, and I think that it will continue to happen.
Yeah, we've seen very active housing activists in Lisbon, and that's the reason that they are protesting against these high prices. And recently, Barcelona also had some protests. So, yeah, looking forward to hear more and see insights about that in your research, like what will happen to these Mediterranean cities in the
Mhm.
future.
I wish I could predict, but it does seem like the start of something bigger. And I think finding a language to talk about it. And I really respect the activists because the language that they've used, it's not xenophobic. It's not like us versus them. It's not, I think they've done a lot to control the language and say, look, we're all part of the EU. We need a solution that it's not just like, this is our neighborhood, get out. Uh, do you want to share it with people? We do want people to come here, but we don't want it to be this unlivable thing. And so I think they've done a really good job controlling the sense of outrage. But I'm wondering what proposals they'll make and what kind of way that they'll frame this in the future.
Thank you, Max, for joining us today and sharing very interesting insights about your research on international property investments and digital nomadism.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a great pleasure.
Thank you for listening. Check out academic experience elsewhere.